Our next speaker is Gary Snow, Vice President, Exploration and Head of Geology from Goldfields, Australia. Gary is a geologist by training with over 30 years' experience in exploration, mine geology, leadership and board level roles across the globe. Formal qualifications include a Master of Science in Structural Geology and an MBA. He's worked on most continents, including Antarctica, and in most commodities. During his career, Gary has worked for both junior and major companies, with some of the more memorable roles including early stage operations manager for BHP Minerals, with responsibility for Australia and Asia, global iron ore exploration manager for BHP, and chief operating officer for Chalice Gold, executive general manager exploration and new business for Intrepid Mines. Highlights during his career include leading or being part of teams that have made major discoveries in gold, copper, manganese, nickel and iron ore on 5 different continents. Gary is passionate about ensuring geology as a cornerstone of any successful exploration or mining business. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you very much. Can I say it's an absolute pleasure to be back in Kalgoorlie. Every time I come here, I'm amazed at how many of my old colleagues have aged. I think this is my 15th diggers, and I honestly love coming back here. There are going to be forward-looking statements in this presentation by definition, so please, in your own time, have a careful look at the statement and take on board everything that it says. If you need any explanations, our lawyer is in the room. Kelly, you can talk to her. Goldfields is a global company. We operate 8 mines around the world, and we're involved in one other as non-operating partner. That's Asanko in Ghana. We're operating in 5 countries. These are our first half 2020 figures. Attributable production of just over 1 million ounces at a US all-in cost of just over $1,000 an ounce, for a net cash flow of about $320 million for the first half of this year. If you come across to Australia, we operate 4 mines in Australia. You've heard Duncan very adequately describe Gruyere, so I won't talk very much more about Gruyere. In fact, I won't talk about it at all. The other operations are St Ives, just down the road in Campbell, Granny Smith up near Laverton, and then the Agnew operations west of Leinster. You can see from that our attributable production for the first half of the year is just under 500,000 ounces at a cost of $960 US. If you've done your sums straight away, you would see that the Australian region produces nearly half of Goldfields gold and contributes significantly to the group cash flow. Last year at Diggers, our Executive Vice President, Stuart Matthews, introduced the wind farm we were building at Agnew. I wanted to give you a bit of an update on that before I move into the exploration side of this presentation. The top left photograph is the 4 turbines. They're fully operational now. We've also built a solar farm, which you can see in the foreground. The top right picture is not some poorly endangered bat that's flown into the blades. They're actually people for scale. And the bottom central photograph is the solar farm we've built at Granny Smith. All of these are supported by natural gas and battery systems. Some interesting stats: the height from ground to the hub on these turbines is 110 metres. The actual blade size 69, so ground to tip at top just under 180 metres, and at 12 RPM maximum speed, those tips are doing well over 300 kilometres an hour. You can see the size of the solar farms. Granny Smith is a very large, covering approximately 21 hectares. And at peak production, the Agnew renewables will supply about 54% of Agnew's needs, and Granny Smith at this stage 10%. Those two combined efforts will take approximately 40,000 tonnes of carbon emissions out of our annual production, which is an amazing step, and combined produce about 74 gigawatts of power. We are looking at renewable projects on all the rest of our operations. Duncan touched on one very briefly. It is an area that we will continue to put more and more effort into. We've recently completed an 800-person camp at Agnew. I want to come back to this later on because there's a reason we're investing at Agnew, and I hope I hope everyone can understand that you don't put in infrastructure like this without a real belief in where that mine is going. So bear that in mind as we go through this presentation. Finally, what I really want to talk about for the rest of this, given you heard my bio, I'm an exploration geologist at heart. In the last 5 years, Goldfields has spent $453 million exploring in the Eastern Goldfields on our properties. That's a substantial amount of money in anyone's books. And I will hope to show you, well, I will show you by the end of this presentation where that money has been spent and the kind of return it's giving. So $453 million. I'm only going to be talking about the last 5 years, and we believe there are 4 main levers you have to control in any exploration project. They're summarized by that top triangle. Basically, you have budget, you have process, people, and ground. Mix any of those components and you will affect your time to discovery. I've already touched on the budget, significant budget, $453 million. The next most important thing is obviously your ground. If you're on poor ground with very little prospectivity, doesn't matter how much money or process you throw at it, you're never going to get anywhere. So let's look at our ground. If we go across to the table on the top left, Wahroonga and New Holland constitute the mining centres that make up Agnew. You can see when they were discovered, first production, and they produced about 8 million ounces to date, giving them a life of well in excess of 30 years. Granny Smith is made up of 2 major deposits, the Granny Smith Complex and Wallaby. Again, you can see the discovery dates, 8.5 million ounces to date, 30 years life. St Ives, which is just an incredible piece of ground from a geological perspective, discovered somewhere around about 1979. It's a bit hard to tell with all the nickel boom that was happening. 13.3 million ounces to date, somewhere around about 39 years of life. And then Gruyere, that Duncan mentioned, a year into production, a considerable life ahead of it. So we believe that we are well and truly investing in the right ground. And we'll continue to look at that. The 2 slides on the bottom left, we're experts at exploring undercover. 2 of our tenements are covered by major lakes, and we've explored all the way through those, and I'll show you some detail on it. The bar charts, the bar charts are Goldfields' history in exploration dollars since entering Australia in 2001. Some of the Barrick assets were acquired in 2013, and then the joint venture you can see with Gruyere in 2016. The last 5 years, the 2015 to 2020 period, is where exploration expenditure has really taken off. I'm going to swap over to process now on that triangle. We built a bespoke exploration management system called GEMS, or Goldfields Exploration Management System. This is a cloud-based or server-based program that lets you control all expenditure financially, technically. You can rate and rank. You can do anything you want in this program. This is the opening page of it. And you can drill down onto any of your mines and find out any information you want. The next page you may not be able to read is a target summary. It'll go through the physicals of what's actually going to be tested on that project. It'll contain all the geological data. This happens to be a prospect on the Karramindie Shear west of St Ives. On the left, regolith with gold, and on the right, magnetics with gold. But most importantly is there's a full set of economics within this database. So every single prospect has to go through a resource range analysis, which is the top graph. This is where the geologists are required to argue about the size range they think a prospect could be, and then through a process of peer review, arrive on a mid-case. That mid-case is then used to run economics, which is the bottom 2 lines, tables, or the rows in the table that you can see there. That will very quickly, with site cost, determine whether this is really a surface, an open pit target, an underground, or both. It'll calculate what we believe the NPVs of those will be, as well as the costs. This lets us allocate money to the most prospective areas across the group and drives exploration success. The next part of our process is the collection of what we call foundational data. There are 3 parts that are important to discovering shear-hosted gold. It's geochemistry, geophysics, and structural understanding. Now, in the geochemistry side, I want to just acknowledge a geochemist of ours, I'm not sure if she's in the room, who has worked with us for the last few years, Heidi Pass. Heidi has done a lot of this work. Basically, we collect samples at fresh rock spacing of 400 meters under lakes across the surface everywhere. So every single one of our tenements has a fresh rock sample from undercover every 400 meters. Each of those samples has 52 elements, gold, alteration, everything you can think of has been thrown at those samples. The result of it, this is Agnew. Top to bottom in Agnew, you now have a completely geochemically defined lithology. You have alteration and mineral maps, and you can, from this, you can literally plot out pathways, fluid pathways. In hydrothermal gold, you want to be exploring in a fluid pathway. You don't want to be wasting your money or anywhere else. On top of that, we have gone to a large effort to define what footprints of all our mineralization, and in fact, most of the mineralization in the Yilgarn looks like. So we know what it looks like from a physical perspective, and where we have chemical signatures, we know what they look like from a chemical perspective. The importance of that is that we can fine-tune our exploration basket, if you want, to increase our probability of discovery. And there's some examples up there. Hillside is a very small deposit. We know with our current exploration package, we'll only find that 30% of the time, and that's quite fine. 20,000 ounces is not going to make goldfields. So we have tweaked this such that somewhere around about, say, 165,000 ounces, we'll find it 50% of the time. Much bigger than that, we'll find it 100% of the time. And we can tweak this wherever we're working. We put a large effort into geophysics. That's the St Ives camp, 35 Ks. This is detailed gravity, so individual stations vary from, say, 200 to 50 meters. You can zoom into drilling scale on that. We also put a lot of effort into magnetics. This is underneath the lake at Lake Lefroy, 3 kilometer scale, 50 meter magnetics, which by most explorers' books is an exceptionally good data set. Our geophysicist, a bloke called Andrew Foley, has spent a lot of time on salt lakes, as you can see from the name. He has developed a skid-mounted magnetometer that you can pull across the salt lakes. Our line spacing when we use that is about 7 meters. And then with the recent advance of drones, we have developed an airborne system. It just flies continuously all day, just changing out batteries. I want to show you what that means in terms of resolution now. So I'm going to take this image, shrink it down to the top left-hand corner, and that is the same image at 7.5 meter spacing. And pay particular attention to the amount of detail that's resolved in some of those areas. So now you have that mix of very detailed geochemistry, very detailed geophysics. You can zoom in literally to a drill hole scale when you're targeting. We've also gone through all of our deposits with a consultant, Sarah Jones, and she has relogged most deposits structurally, which when combined with all those previous data sets provides an incredible targeting tool. The next step I'm going to get to is the more forward-looking exploration program. It's as we head, not just undercover, as we head to depth, it's how we're going to go about this. And this is one of the examples. The total project is called YETI, or Yilgarn Exploration, Technology and Innovation. A bit of a play on my surname, been called lots of things in my life. The abominable Yeti is one of them. And really we're looking at next generation tools. So this is the historic Victory mine, 3.6 million ounces at St Ives. We shot a 3D seismic cube over that about 3 years ago, and we're still working through that. I think this is the first time this has been shown in public. The open pit for reference in the center there, for people who don't know much about seismic, basically the blue and red lines are strong reflectors. Where they are disturbed, it's either a fault, an intrusion, some fluid flow, or something that's going through to destroying that pattern. Now, the Australian Geological Survey had put a two-dimensional line across here. Sorry, the scale on that is the vertical scale is just over 3 kilometres. The Geological Survey had put a two-dimensional line through here some time ago, and this Victory Dome had been recognised, this feature at depth. What hadn't been recognised was this feature sitting immediately below 3.6 million ounces of gold. We managed to get co-funding for a very deep hole. We drilled a 1,700-meter hole into this. It turns out it's a bunch of porphyries and intense alteration and sulfide mineralization. If you were in South America looking for porphyries, you would get incredibly excited when you saw this. The 1,700-meter hole, the last 1,200 meters of that hole ran consistently over about 0.22 grams per ton gold. So if ever there was a smoking gun for the system above it, it's this. We've also spent a lot of time looking at how to become more efficient with core. Obviously, as you test deeper targets, it's going to be diamond drilling. So on the left-hand side are two columns of logging by a geologist, alteration and lithology. The next column is gold. Then a range of elements and element ratios defined from scanning, various methods of scanning. Now, we have been teaching computers to recognize best correlation between multiple elements, and we can now take a hole like that, which is 290 meters, sampled almost top to bottom, and you can reduce that sampling to maybe 60 meters. So the main area, the computers are becoming predictive now about where we should throw our geological effort. We're not going to replace geologists, we're just going to use them for value add on the really important areas. We will do more work on this in the future. Technology needs to accelerate a bit more. Quick look at our operations. Granny Smith produces about 265,000 ounces a year, 8.3 million ounces of resource and a reserve of 2 million. What I'm going to do in the next slide is look at the growth and exploration in Wallaby over 5 years. You should see as this scrolls through each year's resources and reserves adding up. We have not found a base to Wallaby just yet. We are currently drilling the Zone 135 and Zone 150. I think it's fair to say the ore bodies look exactly the same as we've mined in the higher parts of the mine, maybe a slightly higher metamorphic grade. Total vertical depth now is about 1.9 kilometers. This is an absolute world-class deposit. At the time of purchase, there was 3.2 million ounces of resource and just under 1 million ounces of reserve. We've mined 2 million since then, and that deposit has recovered about 4.6 million ounces to date. It remains open. Jumping across to Agnew, produces about 225,000 ounces a year, has a much smaller resource of 2.5 million and a reserve of about 0.8. I'm going to show you the same 5-year scale, but this time only looking at one of the mining areas, New Holland. Pay particular attention to the right-hand side of the slide. That area, Wahroonga North and Kath, in 2015 there were a few holes into Kath, very little known about Wahroonga North. That has now turned into a major production centre for Agnew. All of the deposits are, or all of the chutes, whatever you'd like to call them, are open at depth, and we continue to drill those as we can. There are difficulties drilling these around drill positions and mining, but that is wide open. Perhaps back to that comment about why we're investing in Agnew. Another example of growth at Agnew is about 4 to 6 kilometres south of Wahroonga North that I've just shown you, is this historical deposit called Redeemer. Now, Redeemer was mined some time ago, it's backfilled. There used to be a resource on the books that was taken off because there was very little chance of mining it economically. In 2018, we put down an exploration hole to the north of that just to follow up on a concept. That hole on the way went through what is now the Redeemer Zone 2 North mineralisation. We are continuing to drill that out. There's the first resource that has appeared on the books. Zone 2 North appears to still be open down plunge to the north. We also last year put a few holes below this conceptual pit called Barren Lands, and that has now defined a narrow plunging chute over about a 900-metre down plunge length. It's narrow both in strike and in width, but it runs very nice grades. So the economics of this area is changing. Hopefully that historic Redeemer has now had its economics improved by having infrastructure on the way. I should point out, static infrastructure doesn't exist. These are conceptual models being run by our engineers at the moment. We are very, very hopeful for this area, and hopefully in a year's time, or when our supplement comes out at the end of the year, you will see a change in these numbers. Multiple studies underway and new discoveries being made. Jump across to Sinai, it's the largest of our Australian deposits, 360,000 ounces production, 4.4 million ounces in resource and 2.3 in reserve. I'm going to run the same 5-year timeline of Invincible, and you can see the growth occurring absolutely everywhere. Invincible South is particularly impressive in terms of the grades that are coming out of it. So that mineralisation now exists over 5 kilometres of strike, and that is pretty impressive for a shear-hosted ore body. We've mined about 1.3 million ounces to date. All the chutes remain open down plunge. So in summary, we spent $453 million on exploration in the last 5 years. During that time, we've mined 4.9 million ounces. We've added 10 million ounces in effectively a brownfields environment through discovery. More than 60% of that has converted to reserve at discovery costs of 45 Australian an ounce for resource and 71 for reserve. I think those are pretty impressive numbers. So in summary then, just closing off, we have an attributable production for this half of about just under 500,000 ounces at a cost of US $960. We continue to see year-on-year growth in resources and reserves. I've mentioned the discovery costs of 45 Australian and 71 an ounce resource and reserve. And as long as the Australian operations keep discovering and producing at this rate, they will be well funded by Goldfields. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Before Gary sits down, any questions from the floor? No, you've done a great job. Thanks very much, Gary.